The silence on Thorn's Landing was not the silence of peace, but the tight, compressed quiet of a structure bearing an impossible load. Solomon Carter knew that kind of silence. He had built it. South Carolina, 1893. The high promise of reconstruction lay moldering in the damp southern soil, replaced by something harder and more cunning, the ledger book. Solomon was free, the law insisted, but his existence was measured in the cold arithmetic of debt peonage. He owed Captain Silas Thorne, the lord of the sprawling lumber operation, more than he could ever earn, a perfect, self-renewing calculus of bondage. Solomon was a contradiction embodied. His hands, thick and scarred, possessed a genius for geometry and grain that few master craftsmen in Charleston could match. He was 40, but his eyes were ancient, cataloguing the world not by color or custom, but by stress points and shear loads. He had designed and raised every major structure on this land. The vast roaring mill, the sturdy low-slung stockades where the labor crews were quartered, and Thorne's own sprawling mansion, a monument to arrogance built of reclaimed cypress and gilded brass. He knew where the foundations were shallow, where the joists were improperly tenoned, where the chimney stack leaned just slightly to the north. Flaws he'd been ordered to hide under layers of plaster and pretense. The men on the landing referred to him simply as the carpenter. He rarely spoke, conserving his words like he conserved his strength, watching the relentless dance of the mill, the screaming saw blades, the stacks of raw lumber rising like false prophets against the sky, the exhausted, sweat-drenched crews driven by men whose brutality was legally sanctioned. Solomon's only tie to the future was Elijah. His nephew, 17, bright and cursed with an idealism Solomon had long extinguished. Elijah worked in the yard, stacking timber, but his ambition was to learn bookkeeping, to understand the system that kept them trapped so that one day he might find the loophole. Solomon didn't believe in loopholes. He believed in fundamental structural failure. But he indulged the boy, teaching him how to read a measuring tape, how to check for squareness, how to look past the surface of things. "They call this freedom, Uncle," Elijah had said once, leaning against a stack of pine fresh with resin. "But the man who holds the ledger holds the chain." "The ledger is just paper, Elijah," Solomon had replied, sanding a walnut piece until it gleamed like dark water. "A chain is a system. It's the foreman's whip, the sheriff's law, and the judge's signature. And every chain has a weld that can be struck." Thorne's Landing was a perfect machine of profit. The lumber mill fed the northern demand for building materials, and Thorne fed the mill through two primary arteries: the nominally free workers like Solomon, trapped by debt, and the convict lease system, a horrifying hybrid that was slavery in all but name. Local law enforcement, in collusion with Thorne, routinely arrested black men for petty, fabricated offenses: vagrancy, loitering, insulting a white man. These convicts were then leased back to the highest bidder. Thorne was always the highest bidder. The lease crews were the cheapest, most disposable labor. They worked under the eyes of Overseer Harkins, a man whose cruelty was a calculated performance designed to break a man's spirit before his body. Harkins was the physical manifestation of Thorne's greed, a necessary hammer for the system. Solomon avoided the convict stockades, not out of fear, though fear was a constant low-grade fever here, but out of necessity. He had to remain useful, remain indispensable. He was the only one who could maintain Thorne's elaborate steam engine and keep the mansion's plumbing from flooding the high ceilings. Indispensability was the closest thing to armor he possessed. Then came the spring of 1893, and the armor failed. Elijah had been doing errands in town, delivering a finished mahogany cabinet Thorne intended as a bribe for the county sheriff when he was seized. The charge was theft of property, a loose bolt he had picked up in the street. The trial was a formality lasting 45 minutes. Judge Crawford, a man who regularly dined at Thorne's table, signed the order. Elijah was sentenced to 3 years of hard labor, which meant inevitably 3 years under Harkin's watchful, brutal eye at Thorne's own mill. It was less a sentence than a transfer of property from the county budget to Thorne's profit column. Solomon was away fixing a roof leak 20 miles upriver. When he returned 3 days later, his world had shifted on its axis. He went straight to Thorne's office, a polished room filled with the smell of cigar smoke and expensive leather. "Captain Thorne," Solomon said, his voice rusty from disuse, "my nephew, the charge is false. I will pay his fine, whatever you demand." Thorne, a thick man whose face was a study in entitlement, leaned back in his imported chair, the springs squeaking under his weight. He held a crystal glass of whiskey. Solomon, you know how the courts run. Crawford is firm, and I need the boy. He's strong. I'll give him good work. Hard work." Thorne paused, sipping the whiskey. "As for paying his fine, Carter, you are already $37 in the hole to me. Where would you get the money? Best to let him work it off. He'll be a man when he comes out." Solomon knew the lie. No one came out of Thorne's lease cruise intact. They came out broken, or they didn't come out at all. "I built this room, Captain," Solomon said, his eyes scanning the beam over Thorne's head. "I know every nail in this house." Thorne laughed, a heavy, self-satisfied sound. "And a fine job you did too, which is why you'll continue to work, building more, maintaining more. Now get back to the engine house. That steam valve is leaking again." Solomon stood there for a beat too long, a tension coiled in the air, the kind that precedes the snapping of a rope under strain. Thorne, sensing the disrespect, narrowed his eyes. "Something else, Carter?" "No, sir." Solomon turned and walked out, his steps measured and deliberate. He did not go to the engine house. He went to the stockade fence. He did not speak to Elijah. He could only watch him from a distance, near the timber stacks where his nephew was already bent double, stacking heavy planks. Even from 50 yards, Solomon saw the shadow under Elijah's eyes, the stiffness in his shoulders, the beginning of the transformation from a boy with a dream to a man with an expiration date. Solomon watched for 2 weeks. He saw Harkins, the foreman, move through the crews like a plague, using the whip not just to enforce labor, but to enforce despair. He saw the systematic starving, the intentional cruelty. He tried to pass messages, food, water, but the guards were vigilant and the price of contact was too high. He could not risk his own strategic position for a momentary comfort. Then came the telegram. Not a telegram to Solomon, but to Thorne. It was delivered early one sweltering July morning. Thorne read it over breakfast, grunted, and tossed it to his major domo. The official cause of death for Elijah Carter, aged 17, was heat exhaustion and poor constitution. Solomon was tightening a massive iron bolt on the main drive shaft of the mill when the news reached him. It came via an old woman named Mamie, whose job was to clean the soot from the engine house windows. She didn't speak the news. She just stopped cleaning, looked at Solomon's back, and made a small, choked sound. Solomon did not turn around. He did not drop the wrench. He finished tightening the bolt until the metal sang a high, strained note. Then he lowered the tool deliberately to the dirt floor. "How?" he asked, the single word sounding hollow and sharp, cut from granite. Mamie wiped her nose on her apron. "Harkins said he collapsed stacking wet timber by the riverside. Wouldn't stop. They left him there until sundown." She paused, the memory etched into her face. "He was just a boy, Solomon. They worked him like a mule." And the world Solomon saw did not tilt. It settled. Everything that had been fluid, the future, the possibility of escape, the hope of quiet survival, crystallized into a single, terrifying block of certainty. The structural weakness was not just in Thorne's house. It was in the entire foundation of their existence. And if the foundation was rotten, patching the leaks was pointless. For 3 days, Solomon disappeared into his shack behind the mill. The mill manager, noticing his absence, sent a guard. The guard returned, reporting that the carpenter was sick, feverish, and unfit for work. This was a lie. Solomon was sitting perfectly still, hands resting on his knees, staring at the small, rough-hewn table. He was running the problem, not the problem of Elijah's life, which was irrevocably over, but the problem of the chain. Flight was the common response. North, perhaps, via the remnants of the Underground Railroad or to the crowded ghettos of the industrial cities. But flight meant leaving the chain intact. It meant Thorn winning. It meant Elijah's death becoming just another line on the loss of inventory report. No, Solomon was a builder. If he could not build freedom, he would dismantle oppression. He would not seek justice through the corrupted legal system. He would enact justice structurally. He took out a piece of charred wood and began to draw, not a map to freedom, but a blueprint for ruin. He started with the players: Thorn, the head of the system; Harkins, the enforcement arm; Judge Crawford, the legal facade. These three men, linked by power and profit, formed the load-bearing columns of the local economy of oppression. Removing one would cause shifting. Removing all three simultaneously would cause a collapse that no insurance policy could cover and no investigation could easily attribute. Solomon knew their patterns. Thorn, arrogant and predictable, hosting his annual harvest jubilee in late October, inviting all the local powers: the sheriff, the bankers, the judge. Harkins, a creature of habit, spending his pay at the same tavern every Friday night. Crawford, whose health was failing, often sequestered in the quiet solitude of his isolated country home. The plan formed slowly, meticulously, like the setting of a complicated truss. It required absolute patience, technical genius, and a coldness of heart that Solomon now discovered he possessed. The sorrow for Elijah was a fuel, not an impediment. It had burned away fear and left only clarity. His campaign began that week. He returned to work, silent as ever, but with a new depth of focus that unnerved even the mill manager. Solomon was not just fixing the steam valve. He was mapping the entire run of the mill's intricate steam pipes, noting which ones were under high pressure and which were merely for exhaust. He was running a mental inventory of the entire stock of chemicals used for processing the specialized lumber, solvents, varnishes, accelerants. He volunteered for jobs no one else wanted, crawling beneath the mansion to check for termite damage, repairing the leaky roof on the distant, rarely used storage shed, inspecting the mill's ventilation system for dust accumulation. Every single location was a point of interest, a potential weakness. Thorn, oblivious, saw only his most reliable worker back on the job. "Carter, you're looking sharp," Thorn commented one morning, watching Solomon measure a doorframe with unnatural precision. "That fever must have scared the sloth right out of you." Solomon merely nodded, his eyes fixed on the geometry. "Just ensuring the foundation is true, Captain." In the privacy of his shack, Solomon began his second job. He needed specific tools: a specialized saw blade that cut silently, a set of lockpicks he'd learned to forge during his time maintaining Thorn's safe house, and a collection of chemicals, mostly harmless cleaning agents and solvents, that could be mixed to accelerate combustion when heated. His first structural assessment focused on the mill itself. It was the heart of Thorn's wealth, but also the most vulnerable spot. It was constantly coated in fine sawdust, a highly combustible dust that only needed an ignition source and a strong draft. Solomon targeted the main ventilation shafts leading out from the grinding room. He knew exactly where the maintenance trapdoor was, rarely checked, leading to the cavernous space above the main engine. He began the slow infusion. Over the course of 3 weeks, working only in the dead of night, using containers he fashioned from discarded oil cans, Solomon saturated specific sections of the wooden internal framing near the ventilation shafts with a volatile oil mixture he had subtly diverted from the boiler cleaning supply. It would evaporate, leaving behind highly flammable residue. The mill would not just burn, it would explode outwards from the ventilation core. His work was invisible. His demeanor was unchanged. He was the perfect silent machine, moving through the property, measuring, observing, creating the perfect conditions for a catastrophe that would look utterly accidental, a terrible result of poor maintenance in a hurry-up industry. The next column to fall was Harkins. The foreman was too unpredictable, too physically powerful to confront directly. Solomon needed to know Harkins's structural flaws, and Harkins's flaw was drink, women, and arrogance. Every Friday, Harkins rode his horse 5 miles to a dusty crossroads tavern known as the Red Barrel. He would drink until he was loud and belligerent, often staying until near midnight. Solomon rode the same route one Friday evening, keeping to the woods, riding the shadow line. He was not looking for a fight, he was surveying the terrain. Harkins, drunk and full of himself, stumbled out of the Red Barrel just before the moon set, his saddle slung carelessly over his horse. He mounted up, weaving dangerously down the dirt road. Solomon observed everything. The loose stone wall bordering the main field, the deep rut left by an overturned wagon 3 weeks prior, and the precise moment Harkins usually relaxed his vigilance after leaving the tavern's light. The following Friday, Solomon was waiting. He was not visible. He was merely a force acting on the environment. He used a specialized rope, thin and dark, tied low across the road, masked by the long grass bordering the wagon rut. He did not wait for Harkins to approach. He waited for Harkins to pass the point of no return. The rope was positioned precisely to catch the horse's front legs, low to the ground. When the horse tripped, Harkins was thrown violently forward, his trajectory perfectly calculated by Solomon to hit the loose stone wall. The sound was a dull, sickening crunch, instantly swallowed by the night air. Solomon rode slowly to the spot. The horse was already struggling to stand, winded but not seriously injured. Harkins lay motionless, head tilted at an impossible angle against the rough stones. The foreman's whip, his symbol of power, lay a few feet away, covered in dust. Solomon did not touch the body. He nudged the horse away, then examined the surrounding ground, carefully removing the rope and sweeping the area with a small bundle of branches, eradicating any sign of deliberate interference. It would look like an accident, a drunken fall on a badly maintained road, which, structurally, it was. He was back at the landing before dawn, smelling faintly of pine and swamp moss, his hands clean of blood but bearing a cold, heavy weight. 1 column removed, 2 remained. The system had taken Elijah's life through a natural failure of his body. Solomon would take the system's life through natural failures of architecture and circumstance. This was his reckoning. His work was just beginning. The silence that descended upon Thorn Landing after Osgood's funeral was not the quiet of reverence, but the dense, humid stillness that precedes a hurricane. The official report declared death by misadventure, a treacherous patch of swamp ground, a broken neck, a shame. Master Thorn seemed satisfied with the brevity of the findings, perhaps too satisfied, eager to sweep the inconvenience under the porch and forget the stench of mortality. But Solomon knew the system was already shifting to fill the void. He felt the tightening of the reins instantly. The air grew thinner. Within a week, a replacement arrived, Silas. He was not a local man, hailing from some unnamed stretch of Georgia, arriving with a reputation for efficiency that chilled the heart more effectively than any direct brutality. Osgood had been careless, a drunkard fueled by rage and cheap whiskey, predictable in his violence. Silas was different. He moved with the coiled precision of a cottonmouth, observant, rarely raising his voice, preferring the slow, constant erosion of hope to the quick spectacle of the lash. Where Osgood administered 30 lashes and was done, Silas oversaw an extra 3 hours in the sweltering sun, simply watching. The atmosphere on the landing changed from explosive tension to grinding despair. Solomon, the master carpenter, found his work suddenly under scrutiny. Silas watched him frame the repairs on the new tobacco barn, measured the lengths of the planks, checked the plumb lines. Not because he suspected sabotage, but because Silas was a man who understood that if a thing was well made, it increased the value of the master's property. And Silas's sole mission was maximizing efficiency and value. This observation, Solomon realized, was both a complication and a gift. It meant he had to be flawless in his public duties, a paragon of the dedicated, highly valued laborer. But it also meant Silas was confirming every day that Solomon was indispensable to the architecture of Thorn Landing. The stronger the beams Solomon laid, the more invisible the truth became. Two columns remained. The first and most central was Master Thorn himself. William Thorn was the foundation, the one who signed the bills of sale, the one who wrote the ledgers, the one who ultimately authorized Elijah's death by starvation and neglect. Thorn was rarely outside the main house, a fortress of brick and imported mahogany built high above the swamp fog, a monument to his own perceived permanence. He was obsessed with status and appearance, constantly hosting judges, politicians, and potential investors. The second column was Silas, the newly reinforced instrument of immediate control. Killing Thorn would be cathartic, but if Silas remained, the oppression would continue seamlessly. Silas was the immediate threat, the wolf at the door, but Solomon maintained the strategy, dismantle the structure from the top down. Thorn first. Thorn, however, had learned a small, nervous lesson from Osgood's demise. He stopped riding the muddy trails alone. He kept his favorite hunting rifle perpetually loaded near his bedside. His anxiety, invisible to most, was apparent to Solomon, who spent hours in the shadows of the mansion, measuring the shifting moods of the household like the pressure drop before a storm. Solomon needed the failure to be undeniably structural, an act of God assisted by human frailty and rot. The house itself had weaknesses. Thorn had insisted on an ostentatious ballroom addition 7 years prior, poorly connected to the original 1790 structure. Solomon had warned the previous owner that the support beam over the main hearth, a critical load-bearing point, needed supplemental support if the ballroom was to host significant weight. The owner, eager to cut costs, had dismissed the advice. Thorn inherited the poor architecture but never bothered to fix it. Solomon began his second preparation not with a blade or a poison, but with a small, specialized auger, a tool for precision woodworking. His official task for the month was the refurbishment of the old storage loft above the library, which sat directly beneath the grand ballroom floor. Perfect cover. He spent days removing centuries of dust, working under the flickering yellow light of a tallow lamp, the sounds of his movements muffled by the thick cedar walls. He was looking for the weak point in the main central joist that supported the entire ballroom floor. It was a heart of ancient oak, but years of humidity and the constant flexing from parties had created subtle lateral cracks, invisible beneath the finish. Solomon used the auger to bore 3 precise holes, each no wider than a man's pinky, directly into the central line of the worst crack. He then sealed the entrances of the holes with wood putty, sanded smooth, and stained perfectly. The structure still held the weight, but the wood's inherent load capacity was drastically reduced. The beam was now a silent ticking clock. The danger was in the timing. Thorn entertained frequently, but Solomon needed Thorn to be directly beneath the failure point at the crucial moment, and ideally, only Thorn. This required deep knowledge of Thorn's habits, a knowledge Solomon gained during the brief, excruciating periods he spent inside the main house. He worked slowly, a single hole today, a sanding tomorrow. He noticed Mrs. Thorn, Elizabeth, watching him from the parlor doorway. Elizabeth Thorn was a fragile creature, raised in the stifling confines of Charleston high society, perpetually dressed in silk and fear. She seldom left the house and never spoke to the enslaved people except to issue sharp, short commands regarding silver polishing or tea service. One afternoon, as Solomon was meticulously staining a section of the floor near the hearth, she approached him. She wore a light blue dress, smelling faintly of violet and fear. "Solomon," she whispered, her voice tight, the first time she had ever used his name. "Is the house safe?" Solomon kept his gaze fixed on the wood grain. "Ma'am, Mr. Osgood, he died suddenly, and there is talk in town of unrest. Mr. Thorne says it's just fever, but I feel the house shudder sometimes, Solomon, when the wind blows hard." He dipped the cloth in stain fluid, applying it with careful strokes. "All houses settle, ma'am. This one is old, but the bones are strong. Needs care, that is all." It was the perfect lie, the ultimate reassurance from the man whose skill they trusted absolutely. He was the one tending the bones. He was the one guaranteeing the architecture. His calm demeanor, his focused industry, served as a blanket of false security for the very people he sought to destroy. Elizabeth sighed, a faint sound swallowed by the vastness of the room. "He is planning a reception for the judge from Savannah. Next Thursday, a reception. Heavy furniture, 20 or 30 guests, dancing, heavy footfalls, repeated impact, the maximum possible stress on the modified beam." "It will be fine, ma'am," Solomon said, rising slowly, his back straight. "I will make sure the floors are well polished for the judge." He walked away, leaving her standing there, reassured by his servitude. The reception next Thursday. The timing was fixed. Now he had to factor in Silas. Silas had an unnerving tendency to patrol the main house perimeter after sunset, checking all locks and entry points. Solomon couldn't afford to be seen near the house on the night of the reception. The execution had to be timed precisely to the structural failure, not requiring his immediate presence. He returned to the storage loft the next day, bringing a length of tightly wound hemp rope and a thick block of beeswax. He had prepared a crude but effective timing mechanism. He ran the hemp through a small, unused ventilation shaft that led directly into the ceiling space above the library hearth, the weak spot. He soaked the rope in a mixture of oil and ground sulfur, drying it slightly. He then coated it entirely in beeswax. The mechanism was simple. When the heat from the hearth below rose consistently during the night, the beeswax would slowly melt away, exposing the oil-soaked, sulfur-coated rope to the air. The rope would smolder and burn slowly upward, eventually reaching the final support of a small, decorative iron chandelier that hung directly over Thorne's favorite reading chair in the library. If the main beam cracked from the pressure above, the entire ballroom floor would settle dramatically. If the chandelier fell simultaneously, the focused, sudden impact beneath would ensure maximum localized destruction. It was complicated. Too many variables. The temperature of the fire, the melting rate of the beeswax, the exact moment the ballroom floor would stress the weakened joist. But complexity, Solomon knew, was the handmaiden of accident. The more moving parts, the less likely any inquest would look beyond simple misfortune. He worked on the mechanism for 3 days, his body numb from focus. He found himself thinking less and less about the pain of loss and more about the technical challenges of applied physics. The grief had been weaponized, turned into cold architectural logic. This scared him more than Silas's watchful eye. He was turning into a machine, calculating destruction. Was this what vengeance required? The erasure of one's own heart? On the day preceding the reception, the weather turned foul. The humidity spiked, and by noon, thunder rumbled ominously over the Carolina Low Country, a low-pressure system perfect for the task. The increased moisture would weaken the ancient wood fibers further, and the storm would mask any unusual noises. Silas, preoccupied with securing the livestock and ensuring the integrity of the cotton bales against the deluge, spent the day barking orders at the field hands. Solomon was left alone in the upper reaches of the mansion, polishing the mahogany paneling in the main hallway. He finished his final preparations in the loft, securing the rope, ensuring the path was clear. He placed a small stack of dry, brittle paper directly below the chandelier's hanging wire. Just in case the fall wasn't enough, The resulting fire would finish the job. He pulled the hemp taut. He coated the last foot of the rope near the ventilation shaft in the beeswax mixture. He descended to the kitchen just as the rain began to fall, drumming heavily on the slate roof. He walked past Elizabeth Thorne, who was nervously arranging crystal glasses. "It is a frightful night for a party, Solomon," she said, wringing her hands. "The guests will be safe inside, ma'am," he replied, a faint scent of sulfur clinging to the damp wool of his trousers. He moved through the house one last time before retreating to the relative safety of the quarters. The house was alive with anticipatory bustle, oblivious to the engineered decay within its walls. Thorne was in his library, shouting at a house servant about the wine cellar inventory. Solomon reached the quarters. The sound of the torrential rain muffled the cries of the children and the low murmurs of the adults. He sat on his bench, the smell of pine and swamp moss now completely gone, replaced by the faint metallic scent of fear and the acrid tang of sulfur. He closed his eyes. He could picture the library hearth, already stoked to chase the damp chill. He could picture the heat rising, the beeswax softening, the sulfur catching fire. He could hear the creak of the ancient joist, and then the terrible final sound of structural surrender. He prayed to a God he wasn't sure he still believed in, not for success, but for certainty. He needed to know that his sacrifice, the moral rot spreading within his own soul, was justified. He needed Thorne to pay for Elijah. He waited. The rain beat down, a relentless rhythm against the shack's thin walls. Time stretched, thick and slow. Hours later, long past midnight, when the sounds of the field hands had settled into a troubled sleep, a new sound cut through the roar of the storm, a horrific, grinding crunch, followed by a sharp, cracking roar that sounded exactly like the main limb of an old oak tree splitting in two. It was a sound that carried the weight of hundreds of tons, the protest of wood yielding to gravity and precise malice. It was followed, a beat later, by muffled, distant screams and the immediate rising glow of orange light reflected against the rain-slicked clouds. Solomon sat bolt upright, but did not move. He was clean, he was silent, he was miles away officially. The second column had fallen. He counted the seconds until the fire alarm bells started ringing haphazardly, a dissonant, panicked clamor that confirmed the chaos he had manufactured. The landing was burning. Thorne was dead. It had to be. But then Solomon heard something else, something piercing and immediate. Not the shouts of the enslaved people rushing to draw water, nor the panicked yells of the house staff. It was a single high-pitched scream of pure, cold command cutting through the general pandemonium. The voice of Silas. If Silas was directing the response, it meant Silas was alive and, more dangerously, awake and present. The architect of control survived the fall of the foundation. Solomon rose from the bench, his heart hammering not with fear, but with the cold realization that the system was more resilient than he had anticipated. The destruction of the master's house would disrupt the operation, create chaos, perhaps buy time. But the instrument of oppression, Silas, was still standing, his eyes now narrowed, his suspicion almost certainly turning from accident to act of God, and perhaps soon to act of man. The stakes had risen. The immediate aftermath would be a desperate search for a culprit. Solomon had built his second murder perfectly, but the residue of the event, the new power vacuum, the fire, the inevitable inquest, was the true complication. The fire was raging. The storm was intensifying. The chaos was his shield, but also his immediate overwhelming threat. He had to be impeccable, invisible. He had to walk into the ruins at dawn and pretend to mourn the loss of his master's grandeur. He knew absolutely that Silas would be watching him closer than ever. The final column, the brute force of the system, was now isolated, enraged and focused. The game was no longer about strategy. It was about survival long enough to deliver the final blow. The ash still carried the scent of betrayal, not just the smoke from the grand house which had smoldered for 3 days before rain finally muted it, but the sharp, acrid smell of a man consumed by his own diminishing power. Elijah walked among the ruins, dragging salvageable timber, his back bowed exactly as it should have been, the profile of a man overwhelmed by sorrow and loss. He moved with a feigned inefficiency, heavy boots shuffling in the debris, careful never to meet Silas's eye directly, even when he felt the weight of that singular, manic gaze drilling into the back of his neck. Silas had taken to living in the old overseer's cabin, a structure barely fit for rats, which stood far enough from the main house to have been spared the full fury of the blaze. He had lost his father, his perceived inheritance, and most importantly, in his mind, the unquestioned dominance that had been his birthright. His face was a mask of raw resentment, framed by 3 days of untouched beard. He no longer delegated, he prowled. He was a cornered animal, and the most dangerous predator is the one who has nothing left to lose but breath. "You drop that timber, Black," Silas hissed, his voice raw from shouting and cheap liquor. "You think this is a game? You think God favors your kind because my father's roof fell in?" Elijah straightened slowly, hands calloused and blackened by the ash, holding the heavy beam steady. "No, Master Silas, just trying to stack it right, sir. Want to make sure we got enough left to raise a roof for you." The subservience was perfect, a practiced monotone honed over 20 years. It was the only language Silas understood. Yet something in the cold stillness of Elijah's eyes must have pricked the raw nerve of the younger master. Silas stepped closer, closing the distance quickly, smelling of whiskey and fear. It was too clean, Black, too efficient. The stables burned, but not the fences. The house went up like tinder, but the field stores barely singed. Someone knew where to hit, someone who'd been watching. He leaned in conspiratorially, his breath noxious. "Tell me, Elijah, have you seen any strange men moving through the woods? Any poor white trash looking to settle a score?" Elijah shook his head, keeping the movement slight, deferential. "No, Master Silas, just the men working, sir. Everyone here is mourning the loss." "I'm mourning the loss of you," Elijah thought, the sentiment a cold, hard stone in his gut. The community had suffered the shock of the fire, the sudden disruption, the temporary loss of secure shelter, but the prevailing mood, silent and hidden beneath the required sorrow, was one of terrible, justified satisfaction. They moved through the ruins like shadows, salvaging necessities, but their eyes held a new, cautious freedom. Silas didn't believe him. Of course he didn't. Paranoia was the luxury of the guilty, but he had no proof. The fires Elijah had set were slow burners, initiated by timing devices made of resin and simple chemical reactions he'd learned to mix in the forge. They were engineered to look like carelessness or bad luck. A faulty chimney, a poorly maintained stove. The previous attacks, the sicknesses, and the sudden baffling mechanical failures had all pointed away from human malice and toward divine or systemic failure. Silas was the only one left who had the intelligence, corrupted though it was by ego, to suspect a pattern. Elijah understood the danger. If Silas lived, the pattern would be broken, and the entire structure of freedom they had begun to build, the network of information, the quiet resistance, would be exposed to the scrutiny of a man who now had nothing else to occupy his mind but vengeance. The final blow could not be quick. It had to be definitive, and crucially, it had to make Silas's death appear as inevitable as the ruin he had inherited. The key was the well. The old stone well, deep and shaded, sat near the perimeter of the scorched yard. It was the only source of water that hadn't been contaminated by the runoff from the fire. Silas drank from it constantly, fearing the spring water downstream might be tainted. He also used it, Elijah had observed, as his personal repository for secrets. He had seen Silas dropping a heavy iron box into the well 2 nights prior, muttering about documents that must be kept safe from the inferno. Silas was obsessed with preserving the legal titles to the remaining property and the deeds of ownership for the enslaved population. Elijah spent the next day working near the well, clearing the debris that the fire had thrown towards it. He worked slowly, deliberately drawing water for the temporary kitchen set up under a large oak. Silas approached him late that afternoon, wiping sweat from his brow. "I need that box, Elijah. I need those papers before I ride to Richmond tomorrow. Get the winch." Elijah bowed. "Yes, Master Silas, but the rope is frayed, sir, burnt near the house." Silas kicked a loose stone. "Damn it! Use one of the chains from the smithy then. Hurry before the sun drops, and don't you scratch that box." The winch was an ancient mechanism, rarely used since they had installed a newer pump closer to the fields decades ago. It was heavy iron, and the chain, though strong, was slick with disuse. This was Elijah's opportunity. He retrieved the chain, rubbing it with a rag soaked in axle grease. As he brought it to the well, he noticed the subtle, almost imperceptible flaws in the old winch frame. Specifically, the anchor bolt securing the main lever arm to the stone housing was visibly corroded, a rust-weakened link that had long bothered Elijah during his inspections of the plantation's infrastructure. He knew exactly what was needed to ensure failure. Not a catastrophic break, which would look suspicious, but a failure of weight-bearing integrity. He spent the next hour ostensibly securing the chain, but in reality, he used a small, sharp chisel, hidden inside the handle of his hammer, to gently widen a microscopic fissure he had previously identified in the bolt housing. He worked under the guise of scraping away dirt, his movements subtle and covered by the rhythmic creaking of the old well housing. The damage was done not to the bolt itself, but to the surrounding stone that held it, a hairline fracture ready to give under uneven torque and maximum stress. He attached the chain. The noise of the metal was loud and metallic in the late afternoon air. "It's ready, Master Silas," Elijah announced. Silas, impatient, shoved Elijah aside. "Stand back, Black. I'll pull it myself. I don't trust your trembling hands with these documents." Elijah watched motionless, hands resting lightly on the stone coping of the well. Silas was stronger than he looked, fueled by nervous energy and spite. He cranked the winch slowly, the chain rattling as it descended into the cold, black depth. The sound of the chain finding purchase on the iron box echoed hollowly up the shaft. "Got it," Silas grunted. He began the slow, arduous process of winding the box back up. The friction created a high, whining sound from the unoiled gears. Silas pulled, his muscles straining, his focus entirely on the weight below. Elijah noted the angle of the pull. Silas was standing slightly to the left, putting maximum rotational stress on the compromised housing. The box reached the midway point, a height of 30 feet, the heaviest moment of the lift. A sound like dry bone cracking fractured the evening air. It was not the chain snapping, but the stone housing giving way. The anchor bolt, now loose in its widened socket, jerked violently. The heavy iron lever arm, suddenly uncontrolled, swung outward with brutal force. Silas, unprepared for the mechanical failure, lost his footing as the lever slammed into his ribs. He cried out, a sharp, shocked sound that was instantly cut short. Losing his grip on the handle, he stumbled forward, colliding heavily with the well coping. The sudden shift in weight, combined with the momentum of the falling iron box below, was too much. The coping, slick with mildew and old dew, offered no purchase. Silas went over the edge. He did not scream while falling. There was only the sound of him hitting the water, a deep, thick splash that seemed to swallow all light and sound in the vicinity. Then, silence. Only the soft, rhythmic creak of the empty lever arm swinging gently, a slow, deadly pendulum marking the end of a line. Elijah did not move. He stood exactly where he had been, perhaps an inch closer to the well, but his body language was one of shock, not agency. He waited 10 heartbeats. The silence was absolute. The remaining enslaved population, gathered 50 yards away near the temporary kitchen, froze. They had heard the shout, the wrenching crack, and the final splash. Now they watched the figure by the well, Elijah, waiting. Elijah slowly stepped forward, peering down into the darkness. He called out, his voice pitched high with feigned terror. Master Silas, sir, what happened?" No answer. Only the slight reverberation of the disturbed water far below. He waited another minute, then turned and ran toward the kitchen area, shouting with theatrical panic. "He fell! The winch broke! Master Silas is down the well!" The chaos that followed was precisely what Elijah had planned for. Panic erupted among the few remaining white hands, 2 farm overseers and a young stable boy, all of whom were useless in an actual crisis. They ran to the well, yelling, but no one dared descend. The well was deep, the sides slimy, and the risk of the heavy winch falling further was real. The community of enslaved people, however, moved with cold efficiency. Their instructions, years in the making and delivered through quiet looks and shared signals, were now being executed. While the overseers debated whether to ride for the sheriff, a futile gesture, given the distance and the hour, Elijah organized the rescue attempt. "We need rope," he barked, his voice carrying the authority of necessity. "And lanterns. But careful. If he's alive, he'll panic and drown himself before we can reach him." Elijah had already confirmed that Silas was, in fact, dead. The fall from that height into the shallow, icy water, combined with the initial blow from the winch handle, ensured a broken neck or massive head trauma. He was concerned only with the optics, a diligent slave trying desperately to save his careless master. When the 2 farmhands finally lowered a heavy, oil-lit lantern down the shaft, the light revealed the truth. Silas floated face down, his body listing slightly, the dark water undisturbed save for the faint glow around him. "He's dead," one overseer whispered, his face pale. "He's gone, Lord, have mercy." Elijah knelt by the edge, gazing into the blackness. He did not ask for mercy. He felt a profound, cold sense of closure. The physical danger was extinguished. The financial and bureaucratic structure of the system had been fatally wounded, and the last pillar of immediate localized power had fallen. The recovery was difficult, taking hours and several strong men. Elijah directed the entire process, ensuring that the body was retrieved without further damage to the scene. He pointed out the broken stone housing, detailing exactly how the accident must have occurred, a combination of the old, neglected structure and Silas's impatience. "It was the Lord's will," Elijah said quietly to the head overseer, wiping his hands on a filthy rag. "That winch should have been replaced 10 years ago. Master Silas was worried about papers, but he should have worried about safety." The overseer simply nodded, too shocked and terrified by the rapid succession of tragedies to question anything. With the house burned down and the entire chain of command, father, son, and the structure of their power, extinguished within weeks, the plantation was now leaderless. The moment Silas's body was laid out on a clean sheet on the ground, Elijah knew his true work was beginning. The assassinations had cleared the path, but the path itself was chaos. Chaos was opportunity, but it was also exposure. He needed to consolidate. Over the next 2 days, while the body was transported to the nearest town for an inquest, which amounted to a bored local doctor confirming death by drowning and blunt force trauma, Elijah stepped seamlessly into the void. He was the one who knew the inventory. He was the one who knew the schedules. He was the one who could speak to the remaining hired hands and keep them from fleeing. He presented himself to the sheriff, a stout, suspicious man named Bledsoe, as the only resource left. "The hands are frightened, Sheriff," Elijah explained, standing respectfully outside the sheriff's temporary tent, which had been set up near the ruins. "They fear God's judgment, sir, but they are willing to work. If someone tells them what to do, the crops need harvesting. We must maintain the order. Sheriff Bledsoe looked at the ruin of the plantation, a vast, expensive failure, and then at the calm, authoritative man before him. He saw intelligence and competence, traits he desperately needed. The sudden collapse of such a major economic engine in the county was a crisis, and he had no desire to deal with 80 frightened, unsupervised slaves suddenly deciding to run. "You tell them, Elijah," Bledsoe said, slapping his leather-gloved hand on a makeshift table. "You tell them that the county will manage things until the estate is settled. You keep them in line, and you report everything to me. Everything." "Yes, sir," Elijah replied. He nodded, bowed, and walked away. The overseer, formerly Elias, was now recognized by the white authorities as the indispensable manager of the estate. The shift was profound, yet entirely logical in the shattered context. The remaining bureaucracy needed order, and Elijah was the only one offering it. They had relied on the structure of cruelty. Now they relied on the structure of utility, which Elijah provided flawlessly. He began the harvest, organizing the men with a quiet intensity they had never seen before. He did not use the whip. He used logic and shared self-interest. "We bring in the cotton," he told the field hands late one night, huddled in the dark behind the old smokehouse. "The crop must be perfect. The buyers must see diligence. They must see that this land is profitable without the master's hand. This is the last thing they own. Soon, it will be the only thing they care about." His strategy had evolved beyond mere elimination. Now, it was about proving that the system was redundant. If the plantation could run more efficiently without the brutality of the masters, the entire philosophical justification for their rule was undermined. This harvest, he ensured, was the best the plantation had ever produced. Every pound weighed, every bale properly stacked. He controlled the output, and through it, he controlled the incoming capital. He had immediate and total control over the supply chain, the records, and, critically, the money that would soon be flowing in from the sale of the cotton. The white administrators saw only the profit returning. They were too relieved by the stability to question the mechanisms of that stability. But control was not freedom. He had neutralized the direct threat, but he remained a possession, an asset tied to the land. The law still defined him as chattel, and the estate would eventually be sold, likely to a new, perhaps harsher master. The final blow, the one he had postponed in favor of ensuring the community's immediate stability, had to be delivered before the auction block was set up again. Elijah knew exactly where the new ledger was kept, the one detailing the accounts receivable and the assets, including the list of every enslaved person on the property. Sheriff Bledsoe had locked it securely in a small safe in the overseer's cabin, the same cabin Silas had briefly occupied. The safe, however, was a relic. Elijah had personally installed it 5 years earlier, and he knew its weaknesses better than anyone. It was not fireproof, and its hinges were susceptible to a well-placed, sustained heat source. He waited for the night the sheriff would be away in town, handling the final paperwork for the estate's interim management. It was a Thursday, known to be the sheriff's long night, drinking in the courthouse square after the weekly court session. The community covered for him flawlessly. The usual night sounds, the low thrum of drums, the singing, were slightly louder than normal, a deliberate sonic screen to mask any unusual noise near the cabin. A small cooking fire was maintained, ostensibly for rendering lard, but strategically placed to offer a plausible reason for the smell of smoke near the overseer's dwelling. Elijah approached the cabin just after midnight. He carried 2 things: a small leather pouch containing the tools of his trade, pencils, ledgers, and a tiny vial of lamp oil, and a length of highly tempered steel rod, flexible and strong, that he had forged himself years ago. He slipped inside the cabin silently. The air was close, smelling faintly of Silas's cheap tobacco and stale fear. The safe was against the back wall, solid iron, maybe 3 feet high. He did not attempt to pick the lock. That was too risky and too time-consuming. Instead, he used the steel rod, heated quickly over a small contained fire he built in an iron bucket, to apply focused, intense heat directly to the seam between the safe door and the frame near the hinge. He used the oil, not to burn, but to localize the heat, drawing it inward. It was a technique he had seen practiced by bank robbers, or at least read about in discarded pamphlets he'd found years ago. It required patience and absolute control. For 90 minutes, Elijah worked, shielded by the darkness and the rhythmic noise of the distant singing. The metal groaned softly under the pressure. When he felt the exact moment the metal had softened sufficiently, he used a small pry bar against the heated hinge. It yielded with a thick, satisfying pop. The safe door swung open. Inside, resting heavily on the bottom, was the new estate ledger, bound in red leather. Next to it was a small money pouch containing the cash from the initial cotton sales he had supervised, nearly $500 in gold and banknotes. Elijah did not touch the money. He did not steal the ledger. Instead, he opened the book to the first page, the inventory of assets. His name, Elijah, was written in the clear hand of the late master, followed by a numerical value, $200. Below him, the names of 57 other men, women, and children, each assigned a numerical price. He pulled out his own tools, a sharp feather quill and a bottle of ink he had mixed with a weak acid solution. He began working rapidly but meticulously. He did not erase names, he did not change amounts. That would be too easily discovered. Instead, he went through the ledger, every page, every entry, and used the thin, fine quill to alter the delicate copperplate script of the previous master. Where names ended in hard vertical lines, he extended them into loops. Where letters were sharp, he softened them. He changed M into W, B into P, and T into F, subtly but surely. By the time he was finished, every name, every description, every date in that official county ledger looked like a clumsy, incomprehensible forgery. The value was still there, but the clarity was gone. It looked as though the dead master had suffered a debilitating stroke just before he died, rendering the most crucial document of the estate worthless as a legal instrument. He closed the book, replaced it exactly as it had been, and secured the safe door, ensuring the small fire burned itself out completely without leaving a trace of ash. The strategic motive was simple. When the county tried to sell the property, the single most valuable asset, the people, would be unidentifiable. No new buyer would risk a substantial investment on an estate where the title to the labor force was legally dubious, appearing to have been recorded by a lunatic. The confusion would buy them time to run, time to hide, time to wait for the final outcome of the looming war. He returned to his quarters just before dawn. He lay down, his body exhausted, but his mind sharp. The risk was enormous. He had committed the ultimate crime against the property system, destroying the value of human beings, not by killing them, but by erasing their monetary existence. The next morning, the sheriff arrived early, demanding to review the ledger one last time before heading to Richmond to meet potential buyers. Elijah stood by silently as Bledsoe opened the safe, lifted the book, and began to read. Bledsoe's brow furrowed almost immediately. He flipped the pages rapidly, confusion turning to disbelief, then to blinding anger. "Elijah!" Bledsoe roared, throwing the book onto the table. "What in God's name happened to this ledger? Did one of you idiotic field hands get into this safe?" Elijah approached slowly, picking up the book and feigning astonishment. He looked at the garbled script, the looping, nonsensical letters. "Lord have mercy, Sheriff," Elijah whispered, his voice trembling. "Master, he was struggling the last few weeks, you know. He drank heavy. His hand, it just wasn't right. He swore he'd rewritten this just before the fire. He said the numbers were the only thing that mattered to him." Bledsoe stared at the ledger, his face darkening. The truth, That the previous master had been a heavy drinker descending into instability was well known. The idea that he had ruined his own final accounts in a drunken stupor was entirely plausible. The sheriff slammed his fist on the table. Damn him. Damn the fool. This is useless. I can't auction a single one of these names without clear title. The sheriff left that afternoon, riding hard, carrying the ruined ledger. The auction was postponed indefinitely. Elijah watched him ride away. A quiet triumph settled deep within his chest. The entire property was now in a legal and economic vacuum. They were no longer the highly valuable, highly controlled property of a powerful family. They were a liability, a large group of unsupervised, expensive, and legally ambiguous individuals on a burned-out plantation. The stage was set. The system had cannibalized itself, guided by Elijah's careful, silent hand. The final act was not one of vengeance, but of transformation, from a ghost in the machine to the architect of his own freedom. He gathered the remaining community that night. No singing, no fire, just shadows and the cold light of the moon. "The titles are broken," Elijah told them, his voice a low, strong rumble. "The paper that holds you here is worthless. They cannot sell you, not now, but they will try to fix the paper. When they will return with soldiers, not buyers. This land is dead. It is time for us to live." He looked around the circle of faces, illuminated by the distant, dying glow of the manor's ruins. They were strong, resilient, but still fearful. "We run tonight, north, towards the old ferry crossing. I have secured the necessary funds for the passage. We move as a group, fast and silent. Anyone who stays, stays under the sight of God. Anyone who comes, comes with the understanding that there is no turning back." A woman named Ruth, who had lost her husband early in the sequence of events, stepped forward. Her eyes were clear, decisive. "We go, Elijah. We follow your lead. We've had enough of mourning." They moved out an hour later. 57 souls, erasing their legal identities through forgery, dissolving the final chains through collective action. Elijah, the man who had burned an empire and erased its accounts, took the lead, no longer an overseer, but a shepherd, guiding his flock out of the wilderness he himself had engineered. The ruins of the plantation were their funeral pyre, and they were rising from the ashes, one step at a time, toward an uncertain but undeniable horizon. The final danger lay ahead, the journey itself, the relentless pursuit of the law, and the physical endurance required to walk 57 people into freedom without detection. He had overcome the master's system. Now he had to overcome the world. The air was thick with the scent of pine and burnt sugar, a strange, sickening perfume that clung to their clothes. 57 souls, moving as one dark, elongated shadow through the heart of the Delaware woods, heading north-northeast. Abel walked point, his boots sinking into the wet loam. He didn't look back, he didn't have to. He could feel the breathing rhythm of the column behind him, the quick, shallow breaths of the youngsters, the deep, labored sighs of the elderly, and the steady, determined puff of the men and women who carried the bulk of the provisions. The initial hours after the fire had been a blur of adrenaline and disciplined silence. The blaze at the center of the Thornhill estate was not just an act of calculated destruction. It was a diversion, the largest they could afford. The flames drew the attention of the nearest white settlements, but the accompanying terror, the knowledge of what had transpired in the house, and the realization that the escape was led by minds capable of such brutal strategy, created a valuable hesitation. They were not chasing runaway property. They were pursuing a military unit, or so the fear suggested. Abel used that fear like a cloak. They moved off the main roads, utilizing the knowledge they had gleaned over years of silent observation. The forgotten creek beds, the dense cedar breaks that hid the moonlight, the old hunting trails known only to the enslaved. His primary challenge was tempo. He had to maintain speed for the able-bodied, but he could not abandon the weak. His wife, Clara, walked near the middle, overseeing the small children. Every time they halted, even for the necessary 5-minute stops, Abel would hear her quiet, firm voice, ensuring the young ones understood that silence was life itself. 2 days into the journey, the initial supplies ran dangerously low. The ham and hardtack they had managed to salvage were stretched thin, distributed with the cold precision of a mathematician dealing with finite resources. Abel knew the first rule of survival was conserving energy, and the second was avoiding contact. They were 70 miles from the Thornhill plantation, and the scent of the search dogs was beginning to carry on the wind again, faint but unmistakable. It happened near a small tributary outside Dover. They had been moving since before dawn, stomachs cramping with hunger when they heard the horses. Not the disorganized clatter of an untrained posse, but the deliberate, rhythmic trot of county patrol. 4 riders, moving too fast and too confidently for Abel's comfort. They were using the main creek as a reference point. Abel signaled the halt. He pushed the entire group into a deep, muddy thicket adjacent to the water, ordering them to lie flat, covering themselves in the decaying leaves and the brackish water. The silence was absolute. A collective refusal to breathe. Even the youngest child, 4-year-old Toby, seemed to understand that the wind carried death. The patrol rode past, close enough that Abel could smell the damp wool of their coats and hear the casual cruelty in their voices as they discussed the audacity of the runaways. They say Master Thornhill's brother is offering $1,000 for the ringleader, dead or alive, one man drawled, spitting tobacco into the creek. Damn right, serves 'em right, burning down the man's house. Too much kindness, that's the problem. The words, kindness, cut deeper than any whip. Abel lay motionless, his focus entirely on the sound of the horses' hooves diminishing. He didn't feel rage. Rage was wasteful. He felt the pure, cold satisfaction that their actions had successfully generated the correct response, fear and outrage, which often led to carelessness. The men riding past assumed they were miles ahead, not 20 feet away, hidden by the very mud they considered beneath them. They waited in the thicket for nearly 2 hours after the sound faded. When Abel finally gave the signal, the group emerged, muddy, exhausted, but unbroken. It was then that Martha, one of the elder women, collapsed, not from fear, but from the simple, grinding weight of the journey. Her legs had given out. "I cannot move, Abel," she whispered, her voice like dry paper. "Go, leave me." Abel looked at the 56 pairs of eyes watching him. This was the moment of decision, the instant where the calculation of the strategist met the necessity of the human leader. Leaving her meant leaving a witness, or worse, leaving a body that would be quickly found and tracked. Carrying her meant risking detection for the entire group. He knelt beside her. "Martha," he said, his voice low, "you carry the songs. We don't leave the songs." He didn't lift her. That would be impossible for him alone without drawing attention. Instead, he pulled 2 of the strongest young men, both farmhands named Eli and Samuel. "You will weave a litter from the thickest vines and branches. We move slower, but we move together. We are 57 until we are free." The delay cost them 6 precious hours. 6 hours they moved at a punishingly slow crawl, dragging Martha, now wrapped in layers of damp leaves, across the uneven terrain. But the act solidified the bond. The group saw that their leader prioritized the communal structure over pure efficiency, a decision that brought him deeper loyalty than any threat ever could. They understood. They were a family now, forged in blood and fire, and the family stayed together. They crossed into Pennsylvania 2 weeks after leaving Thornhill, but freedom was not a line on a map. It was a state of constant, gnawing vigilance. They were still fugitives, subject to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which had turned every northern citizen into a potential agent of capture. Abel had targeted Thornhill specifically because his network was so vast, his loss so enormous, that the pursuit would continue long after the county patrols gave up. Their path intersected with the Underground Railroad near a community of free blacks outside Lancaster. This was the most dangerous phase, dealing with outside help, trusting faces they did not know. The conductor was a woman named Eliza, a preacher's wife with eyes that held the quiet certainty of someone who knew the exact measure of evil they were running from. Eliza took one look at the group, the mud, the exhaustion, the quiet, disciplined desperation, and then her gaze settled on Abel. She didn't ask about the fire or the deaths in Delaware. She simply said, "You have traveled far. You have carried a heavy burden of necessary evil to get them this far. Now you must learn to walk lighter." Abel felt the first tremor of relief he had allowed himself in 2 years. It was so profound that it nearly buckled his knees. "They are too many, Mom," he rasped. "Too many to hide, too many to move quickly." Eliza smiled, a weary, knowing curve of the mouth. "The Lord provides the resources for the task he sets. But we don't move as 57. We disperse, small parties. 2 here, 3 there, we break the scent." The decision to separate was excruciating. After facing the world as a unified force, the idea of fragmenting felt like a profound defeat. Yet Abel knew she was right. They had been strong in number, but they were now too conspicuous. He spent the next 2 days meticulously dividing the groups. Children were paired with the most trusted elders. Mothers with infants went with Eliza's safest contacts. Abel reserved the hardest, longest route, the path further into upstate New York, towards Canada, for himself, Clara, and the remaining 9 young men who had been integral to the final sabotage. They were the ones who carried the deepest secrets, and thus the greatest risk. The parting was quiet, marked not by tears, but by firm handshakes and shared knowledge. Before one group of 10 departed under the cover of a massive canvas wagon, old Martha, carried on her litter, looked up at Abel. "You brought us out of Egypt, Abel. God will remember." Abel simply nodded, a promise in his eyes. He hadn't done it for God. He had done it for the pure, logical certainty that injustice must be answered not with prayer, but with mathematics. The journey north became a test of endurance and pure paranoia. Moving in a group of 12, they were less visible than 57, but the stakes were higher. They avoided houses, only traveling at night, surviving on what they could forage, and the meager offerings of the hidden caches left by the railroad. Abel learned the landscape of fear in the north. It was different from the south, not the open, institutional brutality, but a shifty, judgmental suspicion. Freedom was conditional, always balanced precariously on the edge of betrayal. One night, near the border of New York, they took refuge in an abandoned stone quarry. Rain lashed down, turning the rocks slick and dangerous. Abel stood guard with a heavy, rusted axe he had picked up weeks before, a psychological comfort more than a practical weapon. Clara approached him, her face invisible in the darkness. "Abel," she said softly, "when we are across, what will you do? We have the gold. We can buy land. Be safe." The gold, the small cache of coins taken from the plantation office, enough to start a life. It was their insurance. "I will watch the mail," he said. "I will listen for news of the others. We didn't burn that place down just to save ourselves, Clara. We burned it so the others might find their footing." He knew what she was asking. She was asking if the darkness that had allowed him to calculate human worth and eliminate targets had finally left him. If the man who had overseen the careful poisoning of the master's hunting dogs, the measured sabotage of the smokehouse, and the final strategic fire, could ever again be the simple, quiet man she had married. "I am free, Clara," he said, looking at the driving rain. "But the man who got us here, he does not forget what he had to do. He stays. He watches." She took his hand, her touch grounding him in the present. "Then we will build a life around him, Abel. And one day, the watching man will rest." The final crossing of the Niagara River into Canada was the ultimate anticlimax. It happened under a thick blanket of fog, in a small, leaky boat rowed by a grizzled Canadian fisherman who spoke no English, only French. There were no fanfare, no welcoming committees, no shouts of freedom, only the sound of the choppy water and the slow, heavy splash of the oars. When the keel scraped the cold, rocky shore of Ontario, Abel did not immediately step out. He stayed seated, listening to the relieved murmur of his companions as they scrambled onto solid ground. He counted them again. 12. Safe. He finally stepped out, the ground firm beneath his feet. He looked back across the dark, turbulent water, towards the vast, silent country they had left behind, the land where he had been property, the land where he had been forced to become a killer to secure the lives of those he loved. He took one deep breath of the cold Canadian air. It smelled like spruce and snowmelt, not pine and burning sugar. The smell of the South was gone. Abel and Clara settled eventually in St. Catharines. The money from the plantation was indeed enough to purchase a small parcel of land and start a stable life. Abel became known in the community not as a murderer or a fugitive, but as a carpenter, a man of wood, solid and reliable, who never spoke of his past. Yet his vigilance never faded. He corresponded using coded letters, the same internal language he had developed on the plantation, to the network of the railroad. Over the next 5 years, piece by agonizing piece, he received confirmation. 42 of the original 57 had achieved enduring freedom. Some had settled near him, some had gone further west. Old Martha, the carrier of the songs, had died peacefully in Buffalo, surrounded by her grandchildren, a free woman. The legacy of the Thornhill plantation was a silence that spoke volumes. The land was eventually sold, but no family stayed long. Rumors persisted of ghosts, of bad fortune, of the sudden, unexplained absence of authority. The system, built on the brutal logic of ownership, struggled to comprehend the precision of the counter-logic deployed against it. The local white population concluded it was an act of God, or perhaps the work of northern agitators who had instilled violent ideas. They refused to believe that the minds they had systematically devalued had been capable of the strategic planning, the flawless execution, and the cold-blooded necessity of eliminating the pillars of the system. Abel never sought to claim credit. His name was whispered only among those who knew the truth, a silent testament to what desperate courage and ruthless calculation could achieve. He had risked everything, including his soul, but in doing so, he had saved 57 futures. One winter morning, 20 years after the escape, Abel stood by his own hearth, watching the snow fall outside his window. He was graying, his hands rough from honest work. Clara brought him a cup of hot cider. "We heard from young Toby," she said, her voice warm. "He is teaching school now in Toronto, a free man teaching free children." Abel took the cup, its warmth seeping into his weary bones. Toby was the boy who had kept silent in the mud by the creek bed, the son of one of the men who had been essential to the sabotage. Abel thought of Master Thornhill, suffocated by the very system of control he had engineered. He thought of the fire, the sound of the dogs, and the cold, unblinking necessity that had driven him. He had not found peace. Peace was too clean a word for the complicated reality he inhabited. But he had found justice, not the justice of the courts or of God, but the justice of balanced scales. 57 lives traded for a handful of deaths. A brutal calculation, perhaps, but the only arithmetic that mattered in the land they called free. He looked at Clara, his constant quiet anchor. "It was a long walk," he said simply. Clara smiled, a deep, satisfied expression. "But we made it. And we are still walking." Abel nodded. He put the cider down and walked to his workbench, picking up a piece of smooth, untouched oak. There were always new things to build, new freedoms to secure, one precise cut at a time. The past was fixed, a calculated cost. The future, however, was still a masterpiece waiting to be crafted.